Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Springfield. For over 200 years, we've been preaching love and the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Here we don't expect to think alike, but to love alike. We invite you to join us in seeking truth and sharing love with our neighbors. My name is Bob Allman. I'm one of the trustees, and I'm getting the message I should speak up. If you're a guest with us today, we invite you to simply enjoy being with us. You're welcome to join us after the service for refreshments and conversation in that room out there. Do we do introductions at this point? No. Okay. Enjoy the service.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Upper room. The wonderful old, is it a spiritual about the upper room? So I think we should call the Zoom audience the upper room. Audience, congregation, the upper congregation.
You want to take your mask off?
Yes, thank you, Sharon. I'd love to take my mask off. What a nice idea. Yes, thank you. And I'll get myself organized here. Please join me for the beginning of our worship. This service, by the way, is dedicated to the memory of Dan Bancroft, who died January 13th, a dear, dear friend, and in honor of his wonderful wife, now widow, the Reverend Anne Bancroft. Two dear friends committed to social justice their entire lives. Spirit of attention, spirit of February light, great spirit of this blessed, ever-changing earth, be with us this beautiful snow-covered morning, in this sliver of time between wolf moon and snow moon, this moment before the moment, when we trust the promise of the unseen, the movement under the snow only our dog can sense, the dove's call from the pine woods, when we trust what is about to appear, that which is soon to arrive. The story of all ages is really, I don't know whether it's all ages, but I just want to tell you the story of my relationship to history, since that's the topic of the morning, being Black History Month. And the title of my sermon being History Matters. So I thought I'd just start personally with my relationship to history, which was pretty terrible for many, many years. I went to boring history classes. I remember very vividly my American history class in high school. We were only allowed, in our high school, we were only allowed to take one AP course, and I was put in math AP, so I wasn't able to take the history AP. And I could hear them down the hall laughing because the Swire, that's what his name was, the teacher, Mr. Swire, was fabulous, dramatic teacher. And so they all got this fabulous history course, and I was stuck in this very boring one. All I remember from that class is the cartoons of the women's suffragists. Then I went to college and sat in the front row of a European history class that was also as boring. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I fell sound asleep most of the time. It was taught in those days, of course, these broad sweeping generalizations when we had to memorize dates and categories like the 30-year war. I just recently figured out what that war was about. And then the 60s. Then the end of the 60s happened, and somebody handed me a book called The History of Women in America. And it was full of details of people I could relate to. It wasn't about just kings and wars. And it was just transformative, that book. I still love that book. I treasure it. It was just a little tiny paperback. The two things, one, that it was about women, so I could relate to it. But the other thing was that it had details. And since then, there has been, as many of you know, been quite a surge of nonfiction, beautifully written history books, written often by journalists, but they've done their homework. And so that reads like novels. I'm thinking of Lynn Olson, of Eric Larson, some of these really excellent books that you can't put down. And the other piece of my relationship to history was that I want to share with you was a trip that Lori and I took with her mother, her beloved mother, Eleanor, to the Roosevelt Estates in Hyde Park. And we went first to the big mansion, the Roosevelt Mansion, Roosevelt's mother's house, really. And the docent was walking us around, and I'd been reading about Eleanor Roosevelt and how she had her significant relationship was with another woman, Hick, for many, many years, who she actually lived in the White House with her. And so I asked the docent, this was what, about 10 years ago, I guess? I asked the docent about this relationship, and she said, oh, no, we don't know anything about that. And she said, and besides, it's not important.
Oh.
So that kind of triggered me. And so I launched into why it was important that there were the highest rate of suicide among teenagers was around sexual identity. And it was important for us to know the historical figures that went before us that had the courage in the old days to love whom they loved. Well, that didn't go over very well. And so then we went to Eleanor's house. You know, she built a separate house. What's it called? She had a name for it, I can't remember. But anyway, a beautiful little house in the woods that she had Franklin build for herself and her women friends. And so we got a tour of the house, and nothing was said again about her connection with Hick and so I asked again the docent, a different docent, about this, at which point Lori is like, give it up, Nancy. Eleanor's sticking in there with me, all right. And the docent again said, oh, no, there's no, I know there's rumors about that, but there's no proof. And besides, it's not important. So I launched again into why it was important. And then she revealed that, in fact, the day Eleanor died, Hick drove up and emptied the house of photographs and multiple piles of things. We were the only ones there, needless to say. Since then, I've read a lot more about Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's really unconscionable. The history is clear. It's really unconscionable that the U.S. Park Service can't deal with this topic. Maybe it's changed by now. I don't know. My relationship to history. That story, I guess this is where I am. I'm reading nonfiction that reads like novels. And wherever I am, I try to speak up on behalf of people who are afraid to speak up, to correct the historical record. And that's the story for all ages for today.
On the back of your program, you have our affirmation, and we also have it up here. I invite you to join and sing these words. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve the need of all beings, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with the source of our being. Thank you. What's next? Our offering. So Kathy will bring around the plate. Maybe somebody can help her with the basket of food. And your donation to the ongoing work of this congregation and food for the family center. Thank you.
I have a few readings this morning. First one is Martin Luther King. I'm going to be talking about history today, but I'm also going to be talking about our religious tradition and why history is important to us. A religion which we hope is true to its nature. Martin Luther King. A religion true to its nature must also be concerned about humans' social conditions. Religion deals with both earth and heaven, both time and eternity. Religion operates not only on the vertical plane, but also on the horizontal. It seeks not only to integrate humans with the divine, but to integrate humans with other humans, and each human being with him or herself. This means at bottom that the gospel is a two-way road. On the one hand, it seeks to change the souls of human beings and thereby unite them with God. On the other hand, it seeks to change the environmental conditions of human beings so that the soul will have a chance after it is changed. I'm going to repeat that. On the other hand, it seeks to change the environment, environmental conditions of human beings so that the soul will have a chance after it is changed. Any religion that professes to be concerned with the souls of human beings and is not concerned with the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them is a dry as dust religion. Such a religion is the kind the Marxists call an opiate of the people. So that's Martin Luther King. Then the next reading is by Susanna Heschel. whom I've quoted here before, but she teaches at Dartmouth. She's the daughter of the famous Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who was one of whose writings were a huge influence on me and continue to be. I've had the privilege of knowing Susanna a bit and having some wonderful conversations with her. And I asked her to send me a copy of a talk she did on MLK Day a few years ago at Dartmouth, and I'm quoting from that. Her father marched arm in arm with King in Selma. They were very close friends, and Susanna knew Martin Luther King, remembered him visiting as a young girl. She writes, Dr. King gave us all the chance to have lives of significance. He gave us as Jews pride in our Bible, in the prophetic traditions of our Judaism. In his voice, we heard the prophets speaking to us, to all of us, as if they were standing right here today in America. Dr. King taught us that prophetic religion erases all complacency, all sense of self-satisfaction. And we learn to recognize false prophets, like those religious leaders around us today who are inflamed with moral self-righteousness rather than on fire with righteous indignation over injustice. And further on, she wrote, we hear a great deal these days about ethics. Prophetic religion is something different. Justice is not a mere ethical category. If it were, then injustice would be merely a deviation from a norm. For the prophets, justice is a torrent, a manifestation of God's presence, God's tool for redeeming the world, and to defy justice is to deny God. Yet in the Bible, injustice is not met by punishment, but by mercy. Justice unmitigated by compassion would turn this world into a hell of retribution and suffering. Should not Cain, in slaying his brother Abel, have received the death penalty? Justice would require that Abel's blood be avenged, yet Cain is granted divine pardon and protection. God is just, but God is also merciful, especially to those most wicked. Especially to those most wicked. So just to be ecumenical, I've quoted from Martin Luther King, a Christian, from Susanna Heschel, Jewish scholar, and now from this book that has really informed me. This is by Jim Wallace. He's an evangelical, left-wing evangelical. And it's a fabulous book. It was written in, I believe it came out in 2003, 2005. And it's about one of the major claims that he makes in this book is that the religious right and the secular right have joined. And boy, have they joined since this book was written. They have even further joined. It's mind-boggling how a certain very famous person can be embraced by Christians. Anyway, they have. But the left, the secular left and the religious left won't even talk to each other. And that's a problem. And he talks about this at length. But I want to just read you this quote from the beginning of the book about prophetic religion, which Unitarian Universalism claims to be. And in our best moments, we are. Quote, this is Jim Wallace. The loss of religion's prophetic vocation is terribly dangerous for any society. Who will uphold the economic and political outcasts? Who will question the self-righteousness of nations and their leaders? Who will question the recourse to violence and rush to wars long before any last resort has been unequivocally proven? Who will not allow God's name to be used to simply justify ourselves instead of calling us to accountability? And who will love the people enough to challenge their worst habits, coarser entertainments, and selfish neglects? And then I'm going to quote myself. If authentic anger is the life force that cries out for what ought to be, we Unitarian Universalists are or ought to be the angry religion. If we are not outraged, we do not know what is going on. But where in our culture do we teach outrage? We teach tolerance, yes. And while this is certainly an improvement over teaching hate, taught, of course, in fundamentalist schools of all religions throughout the world, tolerance can be a dangerous moral stance. Why not a more exciting challenge, say celebration? Is it harder to celebrate diversity than to tolerate it? Anything short of celebratory, and we miss the point. Not to teach political anger at injustice is not to teach against injustice. It is merely to teach about injustice, as though it were a neutral, observable fact. Isn't that interesting how slavery works? Isn't that interesting how the Nazis used the trains? I hear students say such things in a complete moral monotone, as if it were academically correct to be so indifferent. The mind without the heart is a dangerous thing. We are not the only movement that teaches this, but it is at the heart of our movement. It is its core. The strength of the prophetic tradition of Judaism and Christianity, from which we Unitarians grow, is precisely this: the sanctification of time. This audacious theological claim that the divine enters history, that meaning comes into human life through the reality of time itself, and that we can participate in eternity through an entrance into this very time we so dread. Our culture has corrupted this insight again and again, but it is still a theological truth worth striving for, that the infinite dwells in the finite, that the moments of this world are worthy of love, worthy of our attachment and devotion, worthy of our social activism, our commitment to beauty, truth, and justice. Because it is through those moments we enter into the indwelling of God. Here endeth the readings. Please join me in the spirit of meditation. February light, dearest February light, show us your snow crystals. Remind us of the brevity of your beauty, complexity. Speak to us of connections and our deepest longings. Spirit of February rising, accept our prayers, the sad, the fearful, the requests, and the grateful, that we, by sharing with you and in silent communion with each other, might rest, might trust beyond ego, might trust in your wisdom and in your dark and mysterious sustaining strength. History matters. How we tell our story defines who we are, our personal, familial, ethnic, class, race, national, sexual identity. And our identity affects everything we do and say, everything we censor and do not say, every action we take or fail to take, every spiritual moment of our days. Paying attention to history these days, personal and national, requires equal attention to those who seek to suppress or destroy it. The current political intrusion into the work of American historians and novelists, the banning of books on race and sexuality, the overt capitulation to political pressure on the part of hitherto well-respected institutions, not only threatens our nation's identity, but our own. This identity, this history of self, is always changing, refining itself, redefining itself, re-understanding itself from the new vantage points of our evolving lives. We remember things differently as years go by. We retell even the same story differently. And so it is with the story of a country. History is told not by a single person, but by many scholars trained to review and refine, trained to look from different angles, to understand on a deeper level what happened, why it happened, who we are as a nation, what is a one-time event, for example, and what is systemic. What is a one-time event, for example, or what is systemic? Historians are never without their point of view, which makes their field so vibrant and important. It is dynamic, not static. It happens. It has always been a hotbed of debate, vision, revision, generation to generation. As is our own history debated within us, in our psyche, and in our bodies. We are the past incarnate. James Baldwin on history. James Baldwin. History is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by its many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history, which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because therefore one enters into battle with the historical creation, oneself. Which brings me to the 1619 project, of which this is a part, this book. Can we see it? Can you all see it? How many of you are familiar with this project? Some hands. Zoom, some hands we see? Yeah, okay. So it's let me just describe, for those of you not familiar, and I had lots to learn about it myself. Let me just describe it. It began with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the founder of this, going to the New York Times head honcho meeting in January of 2019, saying August 2019 is the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first slave ship on the shores of Virginia. Let's do something about that. And they agreed that she would write an article for the New York Times Magazine, which she did. She not only wrote an article, but she got other scholars to write articles. And the magazine, the original copy of which I just recently had the privilege of looking at, was published indeed in August 2019. In addition, the New York Times and other organizations got together and came up with a curriculum for schools, came up with, they've eventually done a podcast, which is absolutely fascinating. And I've just begun to listen to the first few episodes. And they also have a docu-series on Hulu, which is also fabulous and available to anyone. And they've put what was originally a magazine into a book, expanded many more articles. It's not only historians, but it's fiction writers and poets that they have included in here, because so little of the history of Black America, or especially early Black America, is written down, that the fiction writers and poets come in, become an important part of how we understand the past in their ability to imagine. And let me quote a little bit from Nicole Hannah-Jones, whom I had the privilege of hearing at Dartmouth. Did anyone hear her? She was here a couple of years ago. But after she became so famous, and she became famous not only, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So these are a few quotes from her. This project is the central argument of the whole project is that the struggles across many generations by Black Americans for civil and political rights have been an essential part of the evolution of our democracy. Quote, our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. You remember the Declaration of Independence? Not happening. 1/5 of the American population at the time that was written were enslaved, right? So not so equal or free. Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true. Through centuries of Black resistance and protest, we have helped the country live up to its founding ideals. We, the Black Americans. We have helped the country live up to its founding ideals. And not only for ourselves, Black rights struggles paved the way for every other rights struggles, including women's and gay rights, immigrant and disability rights. And she asks, what if America understood finally in this 400th year that we have never been the problem, but the solution? That we have never been the problem, but the solution. Black people have been the perfecters of our democracy. Well, you can imagine the response to that. All hell broke loose. Reaction was strong and fierce from the then president on down. One of the problems is that we rely on history, nations rely on history to buoy us up and make us feel proud and nationalistic, right? And the 1619 Project turns that. Jake Silverstein, in his, well, what shall we say, his thoughts on the reaction to the 1619 Project, he's the editor at New York Times, wrote, what if a revolution, the American Revolution, so one of the other claims that's very controversial in the 1619 Project is that that some of the colonists wanted to break from Britain in order to retain slavery, because there was a movement in Great Britain stronger and earlier than in the States, an abolition movement that was strong, and they were afraid that they would lose their rights to slavery if they stayed under the British Crown. What if a revolution conceived as sordid, racist, divisive cannot be the inspiration for a nation? So in other words, if that's true, that the Southern colonists, many of the Southern colonists, if not all the Southern colonists, supported the revolution finally in order to retain their economic strength based on slavery. What if that story about the American Revolution got flipped? What then? Should we set aside the best scholarship in favor of a unifying myth? Is history a science or a patriotic art? Silverstein asks. So one of the reactions was college placement, that wonderful institution that governs our lives in ways that we wonder why. But they create courses like AP course, not like AP courses, right? And they've been working for 10 years on an AP course on Black American history, on Black study, African American studies. Very soon after a certain governor in a certain southern state banned the course, the AP changed, it made some final revisions saying that it didn't have any, it wasn't in relationship at all to the flurry of responses to the 1619 project and the banning of courses in Florida. But news has come out since of hidden emails that it was clear they were in conversation with the people in Florida. But I don't want to go there. I want to point out that one of the most important, so they took out a lot of authors. They like bell hooks and coats and but they also took out the word systemic, which is why I was underlining it earlier in the readings, in my remarks. Heather Cox Richardson writes, one word in particular had vanished from the new AP course in African American history, the word systemic. In February 2022, systemic appeared before marginalization. Systemic marginalization. Systemic came before the word discrimination, systemic discrimination, oppression, systemic inequality, systemic disempowerment and racism. By February 2023, that word was gone. Quote, this is from a teacher. The changes that are happening by the AP are not edits. They're the erasure of Black voices, Black academics, Black experiences. It's cowering to white supremacy, cowering to the political power versus recognizing the academic merits of how the curriculum was from the beginning. And along this line of the reaction, I want to quote from an article in The Guardian by Jason Stanley called "Banning Ideas and Authors is Not a Culture War, It's Fascism." And this was published on the 14th of February of this year. Quote, a wave of enthusiasm for banning concepts, authors, and books is sweeping across the United States. I hope you all know this already, but it bears underlining, 44 states have proposed bans on the teaching of, quote, divisive concepts, and 18 states have passed them. Many of the laws also target, Nicole Hannah Jones's influential 1619 project. These laws have already, I'm still quoting Stanley, these laws have already started to take effect. Administrators and teachers have been forced out of their positions on the suspicion of violating these laws, and what has started as a trickle may soon become a flood. Unlike a culture war, the recent turn has no place in a democracy. In January, Florida's Board of Education banned the AP African American Studies on the grounds that it included concepts forbidden by Governor DeSantis's law, including critical race theory and intersectionality, as well as authors such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Robert Ferguson, Angela Davis, and Tanishi Coates. The College Board chose to remove these authors and subjects from its curriculum, claiming, as it turns out dubiously, that it did so independently of Florida's pressure. And now we know definitively that that was not the case. These laws have been represented by many as culture war. This framing is a dangerous falsification of reality. And this is a really important point. The culture war is a conflict of values between different groups. In a diverse, pluralistic democracy, one should expect frequent conflicts. Yet laws criminalizing educators' speech, criminalizing educators' speech are no such thing. Unlike a culture war, this recent turn has no place in a democracy. And he goes on, in other national contexts, everyone would clearly recognize the problematic nature of laws of this sort. Germany's teaching of the Nazi past creates clear anguish and guilt in German children. If the German far right passed laws forbidding schools from teaching about the sins of Nazism, however, on the grounds that such teaching does in fact quite obviously cause anguish and guilt, the world would not stand for it for one moment. It is frequently claimed by proponents of such laws that banning discussion of structural racism and intersectionality is freeing schools of indoctrination. And yet indoctrination rarely takes place by allowing free flow of ideas. Indoctrination instead rather takes place by banning ideas. Celebrating the banning of authors and concepts as freedom from doctrination, Stanley writes, is as Orwellian as politics gets. And finally, it is clear that the chief agenda of this movement is to advance a set of speech laws that criminalize discussion in schools of anything but the white heterosexual majority's perspective. The media's portrayal of these laws as moves in the culture wars is an unconscionable misrepresentation of fascism. I spoke of Anne Bancroft and said I was dedicating this service to her late husband, Dan, and to her. She's a Unitarian minister. She was minister for many years at the Theodore Parker Church in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. And a few years ago, she invited me down to preach there. And I had the honor of being there preaching on the Sunday that the congregation, it was a very large congregation, was having a congregational wide vote after the service on the question of whether they would put a Black Lives Matter outside the church. This was a very difficult decision. The location of the church is in a fairly posh neighborhood, but very near the rest of Roxbury, which is not so posh. Many of the congregants had friends, policemen friends, and the police in that area, I won't generalize all policemen, but the police in that area were very nervous about these Black Lives Matter signs. And as you know, there were other signs that went up, Blue Lives Matter, that whole thing was going on. And the buildings that had posted those signs in the area had been vandalized. So it was on the part of the congregation, a huge decision and an act of courage to whether they were going to decide to do this or not. Anne had preached the following, the previous Sunday on this matter. And I want to share with you some of her ideas in that sermon. Because it was a beautiful sermon. I didn't attend, but I got a copy of it. And I was able to watch the process, by the way, also of this vote after the service that I did there. And by the way, it was quite an amazing experience preaching from Theodore Parker's pulpit. I just have to say that. But after the service, the congregation was all packed in the parish hall. And I watched Anne move around talking to people. It was just, people were having coffee, but it was all, that energy before a vote happens. And I watched Anne move around talking to different people who were concerned, still undecided. It was very, very moving to see this process. Of course, I hadn't seen the months of processing before that day. I was moved at the time and happy to say they did vote to post that sign. But this is from her sermon. She in her sermon prior to that, she talks about, she told this joke, which I'm sure you've all heard, where two fish are talking. And one of them says, "How's the water?" And the other one says, "What water?" And then Anne defined white supremacy. A system of social order that keeps power and resources consolidated among white elites, using an ideology that upholds whiteness as being best or most normal. It's not necessarily active hatred of people who are not white. It's a system. It's the water most people swim through without realizing they're wet. It's the basic fact of US culture and everyday life, and a foundational truth of this country. And goes on, white supremacy is not just about race, although it is about race because of who it advantages. But white supremacy is a system that pervades our culture, also has characteristics that effectively perpetuate an environment that disservices all of us, that separates us based on power and authority, and who has the resources to make what happen. And the reason it's about race is because it's a function of an historically white way of doing things. White supremacist culture is hierarchical, perfectionist, paternalistic, and defensive. It values bigger and more individualism over community, results over process, either or thinking, and quantity over quality. It dictates who's in the room, who's at the table, and even where the table is. And then she writes, have any of you seen the beautiful arched stone bridges going out to Long Island from New York City? They're on what used to be the only road from the city, and they're too short for buses. Anyone know why they're too short for buses? Lori and I recently saw the play on National Theater, a HD film of Straight Lines something, about Robert Moses, the great architect of New York City and the Jones Beach, etc. He purposely created those bridges so that the people who didn't have cars would have to take a bus to the beaches that he created on Long Island, wouldn't be able to get there. History helps us see the water we are swimming in. History helps us see the water we are swimming in. And if I could quote from myself again. Well, that assumes I can find the quote of myself. History tells us it is past the time to explore systemic privilege, white privilege, systemic white privilege, systemic class privilege, systemic Northeast privilege, education privilege. Time to explore the how some of us have the luxury to be liberal, why some of us can resist fear tactics, and why some of us cannot. June 12th, 1963. Fannie Lou Hamer is brutally beaten and left to die in a Mississippi jail for having dared to try to register to vote. And on that same day, Medgar Evers, veteran of World War II, Mississippi's first secretary of the NAACP, an investigator of violent crimes against Blacks, is gunned down on the front porch of his home. Months later, his widow, Marilee Evers Williams, a witness to her husband's murder, a leader in the civil rights movement herself, speaks of her love of America, shares the 2 times she felt most patriotic. First, when her father returned from World War II in full uniform, and the second time when she sat by her husband's grave in Arlington National Cemetery, receiving the flag that had draped his coffin. She felt patriotic because, she said, Medgar Evers had died fighting for his country. Some in our country talk about terror as if we experienced it for the first time on 9/11. But Americans have experienced terror since its beginning, since the white lion landed on that Virginia shore in 1619. We have experienced terror in the lynchings, the burned churches, in schools, restaurants, in drive-by shootings, in police dogs, and on bridges, in the mass slaughter of Jews at prayer. Terror is nothing new to Americans. And anyone who dares to stand up to it, to speak of the hate, to investigate the crimes, that person is prey to more terror. We must know this history. Americans have known and still to this day live in terror because the theology of hate is very much alive and well organized across this country. The theology of hate is alive and well, not just on race, but in issues of religion, class, gender, and sex. I wanted to write a prayer for this morning. This day in Black History Month of 2023. And so I have. This history is our prayer. Knowledge of the struggle is our prayer. Our patriotism, our anger, our salvation. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, from the verdant mountains of Vermont, the troops are still in front of us. Sheriff Jim Clark's posse is still on horses about to charge into the crowd. But we have this prayer that is history. This history is not behind us. This history is at our side. This history is on our side. This history, this prayer is within us. As much as Selma was the nation's date with destiny, as King said with terror in his face as he announced they would indeed go ahead with the march that Tuesday after Bloody Sunday. Today is this morning, now, today, tomorrow is our date with destiny, our time, in our own way, with our own anger, with the issues that are ours to fight. We continue our legacy in prayer, in remembrance, on our feet. The great Rabbi Abraham Heschel, after walking from Selma to Montgomery, said to his daughter, Susanna, "I felt my legs were praying." Our prayer today lies in the simple complexity of remembrance, the quiet revolutionary patience, the thirst for history, the commitment to self-knowledge, a theology based on courage against impossible odds, the prayer of action for the sake of justice and for the sake of peace. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountain side, let freedom ring. I want to thank Tina Wood for the beautiful piano. So glad you're here. And this painting.
Yes, that's Tony.
Oh, where's Tony? Oh, okay. It's really beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And a thank you to all that make these possible, and a shout out to Ireland. Dear Louise, St. Louise is on Zoom. Closing words. As the morning calls us forward, as we walk out into lengthening days, let us live in the verbs of hope. Let us, with humility and grace, walk, rest, climb, wander, wonder, drift, and sit, casting our eyes to where the worlds of unseen magic lie before us and behind us, below, in this sacred ground, the sacred soil, this blessed earth. Let us open our hearts and roll up our sleeves in partnership, inspired by all the diversity of our species and our earth. Let us above all hear the prophetic call of our times. And when the time is right, answer with Isaiah, Hineni, here am I, send me. Amen.